The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which struck Madeleine Voss as the cruelest detail of all. Not a Friday, when she might have had the weekend to fall apart quietly. Not a Monday, which would at least have had the decency of feeling like a beginning. A Tuesday, the most unremarkable day of the week, and yet the one on which everything she had ever known was taken from her. She did not cry when she read it. She had taught herself not to, years ago, in the drawing room of Ashvale House, when her father had told her that a young woman who cried in public was a young woman who could not be trusted with serious matters. She had been 11 years old. She had not cried since, not properly, not the way she wanted to now, standing in the cold hallway of her rented room in Edinburgh, with the solicitor's letter in both hands and the smell of boiled cabbage coming from somewhere down the corridor. The letter was from a Mr. Hartley of Hartley and Soane, Solicitors, London. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph established that her father, Sir Aldous Voss, no, that was a used name. She'd need a different one. Sir Crewe Fairfax of Ashvale House, Northumberland, had passed on the 23rd of October. The second paragraph established that the estate, the house, the lands, the investments, the accounts, and everything therein had been left in their entirety to one Mr. Dunstan Fairfax, her father's nephew and the closest male heir, in accordance with the terms of the entail. The third paragraph offered condolences. It was the shortest paragraph. Madeleine read it twice. Then she set it on the narrow table by the door, next to the candle she couldn't afford to replace until Friday, and stood very still for a long moment. She had known about the entail. She had always known. Her father had mentioned it often enough, not cruelly, she didn't think, but with a kind of resigned practicality that she had inherited from him, along with his gray eyes and his tendency to hold a cup of tea with both hands. The house goes to the male line, Maddie. It has always gone to the male line. That is simply how it is. What she had not known, what no one had thought to tell her until this Tuesday in November, was that her father had also borrowed heavily against his personal accounts in the last 3 years of his life, and that those accounts, the ones she had believed would come to her, were now almost entirely depleted. She learned this in a second letter, which arrived the following morning, this one from her father's private banker. It was longer than the solicitor's letter, and considerably less polite. She had £43 to her name. The room in Edinburgh cost 4 shillings a week. She had worked for the past 8 months as a music teacher to the daughters of a merchant family on Heriot Row, and she had been paid tolerably for it. But tolerably was not the same as well, and £43 was not the same as a future. She spent 2 evenings making lists. She was very good at lists. They gave her something to do with her hands, and her hands, when unoccupied, had recently begun to shake in a way she didn't care for. The list of options was short. She could remain in Edinburgh and continue teaching, though the Hargreave family had already hinted that their daughters were nearly done with their lessons and would be moving on to more social pursuits in the new year. She could write to her mother's sister in Bristol, whom she had met exactly once, at a funeral, when she was 7. She could apply for a position as a governess, which was the most obvious thing, and which she had been avoiding thinking about because governesses in the novels she had grown up reading were invariably either miserable or else they fell in love with their employer, and she had no patience for either outcome. Or she could do what she had been thinking about since the first letter arrived, the idea she had circled around and dismissed and returned to, the thing she kept telling herself was foolish and dramatic and probably illegal. Ashvale House was currently in the possession of Dunstan Fairfax, her father's nephew. She had met Dunstan exactly 4 times in her life. He was 41, lived mostly in London, had twice been mentioned in connection with a gambling debt of some significance, and had, on the one occasion he had spoken directly to Madeleine at length, spent 20 minutes explaining to her why women were constitutionally unsuited to understanding property law. Dunstan would not be at Ashvale for the winter. He had already written to the estate manager, a letter which Madeleine had not been meant to see but had, because Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who had been at Ashvale since before Madeleine was born, had quietly sent her a copy, saying that he intended to remain in London until spring, that the house should be kept in order, and that he was considering selling a portion of the northern pasture, which had been her mother's favorite walk. So, Ashvale was largely empty. The household staff who remained knew Madeleine, had known her since she was a child, would not turn her away. And there was the matter of the papers. Her father had kept a collection of documents in the library. Correspondence, deeds, old agreements going back 2 generations, and Madeleine had reason to believe, based on certain conversations she had half overheard and had spent the past 3 weeks piecing together, that there might be something among them that bore on her situation. A provision her father had mentioned once, vaguely, to the family solicitor in Madeleine's presence. Something about the dowry trust, established by her maternal grandfather. If it existed, if it said what she hoped it might say, it would not restore Ashvale to her. Nothing could do that. But it might give her something. Enough to stand on, enough to be something other than a woman with 43 pounds and a candle she couldn't replace until Friday. She would need a reason to be in the house, a reason the remaining staff would accept without question, one that would not reach Dunstan's ears in London before she had found what she was looking for. She wrote to Mrs. Pemberton. The reply came in 4 days. There is a position open for an under-housekeeper, the woman who had the post having left in September. The household is small and the work is not light. If you are certain, come before the end of the month. I will say nothing to Mr. Fairfax unless you ask me to. I will say nothing to the others at all. E.P. Madeleine read this letter 3 times, which was 2 more times than the solicitor's letter had warranted. Then she packed her trunk, told the Hargrave family that a family matter required her to leave Edinburgh, and took the train south. Ashvale House in November was exactly as she remembered it and entirely different. The house was the same. The long sandstone facade, the twin chimneys, the drive that curved up through oaks that had been old before her grandfather was born. But the light was different, or perhaps she was different, and the light was only responding accordingly. She came in through the kitchen entrance, as she would for the foreseeable future, which was something she had prepared herself for, and which still required a particular effort of the jaw muscles not to react too visibly. Mrs. Pemberton was waiting for her in the kitchen. The cook, a stout woman named Madeleine Woodlern. Mrs. Granger was at the range and did not look up. 2 young maids were at the table, one polishing silver and one snapping beans. They glanced at her with the moderate curiosity appropriate to a new arrival of no particular standing. "This is Miss Lacey," Mrs. Pemberton said, and Madeleine heard the name she had chosen for herself spoken aloud for the first time and made herself not flinch. "She'll be taking the under-housekeeper's position. I'll show her the house tomorrow. Tonight she'll want supper and rest." That was all. No further explanation was offered, and none was asked for, because Mrs. Pemberton had been running households for 30 years, and her tone did not invite supplementary questions. Miss Lacey. She would be Miss Lacey until she found what she needed. She repeated it to herself that night, lying in a narrow bed in a room on the 3rd floor that was smaller than her childhood bedroom's wardrobe, listening to the wind come off the moor and find every gap in the window frame. She had slept in this house for 19 years. She knew which stair creaked and which chimney drew poorly, and where her father had hidden the spare key to the gunroom. She had played in the cellars and climbed the kitchen garden wall and read every book in the library twice. She was sleeping 3 floors above the room she had grown up in a servant's bed, under a name that wasn't hers. She was also, for the first time in 6 weeks, warm. She slept better than she had since the letters. The work was not light, as Mrs. Pemberton had warned. Madeleine had not been under any illusion that it would be. But there was a difference between knowing a thing intellectually and discovering it at 5:30 in the morning. In November, when the fire in the main hall needed to be laid before the household was properly awake, she was competent with her hands, more so than most women of her upbringing. Because her father had believed firmly that a person of any class ought to understand how their house actually functioned, and had allowed her considerably more access to that understanding than was fashionable. Still, her back ached. Her hands, always sensitive to cold, cracked at the knuckles within a week. She learned to make them useful and keep them out of sight. What she had not anticipated, and what complicated everything, was the Duke. She had known that Ashvale's nearest great estate was Carrow, and that Carrow had passed 3 years ago to its new owner, a man named Piers Dunmore, who had inherited from a distant cousin he had apparently barely known. She had been in Edinburgh when this happened and had paid it little attention at the time. The local papers had been interested in him. He was not a Northumberland man by origin, had made a large part of his fortune in the East, and was apparently doing something unusual with the management of Carrow that had the neighboring landowners simultaneously envious and suspicious. She had not known he was in the habit of calling on Ashvale. He arrived on her 9th day in the house, on horseback, in the mid-afternoon, while Madeleine was in the process of cataloguing the contents of the linen cupboard on the 2nd-floor landing, a task Mrs. Pemberton had assigned her and which she suspected was at least partially designed to keep her hands busy while her legs and her courage recovered from the first week. She heard the hooves on the drive, heard the front door open, and then heard Mrs. Pemberton's voice in the hall below with a quality of particular composed attention that suggested an arrival of some significance. She continued counting pillowcases. She didn't see him that day. She heard his voice briefly, a level, even sound that told her very little, except that he was not a man who needed to raise it to be heard. He stayed perhaps an hour. She learned from the maid, a girl called Nettie, 17 and forthcoming, that the Duke of Carrow called on Ashvale periodically because he and her father had been on civil terms, and that he had apparently not yet been informed through official channels that the estate had changed hands. Nettie thought this was romantic. She used that exact word. Madeleine considered the word carefully and put it away. She saw him 3 days later. She was crossing the front hall, quickly, because she had learned that crossing the front hall quickly was one of the minor arts of domestic service, a form of purposeful invisibility. When the library door opened and he came out, she stopped. He stopped. There was a moment of the kind that happens when 2 people arrive at the same narrow space from different directions, and neither has immediately registered the other as a person with an equal claim to the space. Then he said, "Forgive me," and stepped aside, and she said, "Your Grace," and stepped aside also, and they both stood in the hall for a half-second longer than was strictly necessary. He was taller than she had imagined, which was irrational, since she had not been imagining him at all. Dark hair, beginning to gray at the sides. A face that looked as though it had decided some years ago to stop performing expressions and had not entirely regretted this. He was looking at her with attention that was not quite curiosity and not quite suspicion. Something in between, the look of a man who was very used to assessing situations quickly and who had noted something in this one that required a second look. She gave him nothing to look at. She had learned this from her father, too. She gave him a composed face and the appropriate deference of her current position, and moved on down the hall, and she did not look back, and she did not think about the fact that she had stood in this hall with this man while being a person she was pretending not to be. She thought about it that night, lying in her narrow bed. Then she made herself stop. The papers were in the library. She had known they would be. Her father had always kept his important documents in the mahogany cabinet behind the desk, the one with the slightly stiff lower drawer and the smell of cedar and old tobacco. She had watched him open it 100 times. She knew the trick of the drawer. She knew where the key was kept. What she had not known, and what she discovered on her second careful evening visit to the library, was that the cabinet had been relocked with a different key. Dunstan's work, presumably, or his solicitor's. This was not unexpected. It was simply another problem to solve. She was making progress on the problem. She had written to a locksmith in Hexham, under the pretense of needing a household spare, and was awaiting a careful reply, when the situation with the Duke became something other than incidental. It was the housekeeper who told her, without meaning to, one morning in December, when December had brought the kind of cold that made the old house creak like a ship, and the kitchen the only room anyone really wanted to be in. Mrs. Pemberton was reviewing the week's accounts and making the sort of small, controlled noises that indicated things were not quite right. "The coal delivery is late again," she said, more to the room than to Madeleine specifically. "I can write to Hexham," Madeleine offered. "It's not Hexham. It's the account." A pause. Madeleine waited. "Mr. Fairfax's man of business in London has not answered my last 2 letters regarding the household accounts. We are not in difficulty yet, but if this continues through January—" She stopped herself. "Shall I draft a more formal inquiry?" Madeleine asked. She kept her voice exactly as Miss Lacy's voice should be, helpful, quiet, no particular investment. Mrs. Pemberton looked at her in the way she sometimes did, with an expression that walked a very careful line. "Not yet," she said. "There is someone who may be able to get word to Fairfax more effectively. I will speak to the Duke." The Duke, Madeleine learned over the following days, had a complicated relationship with Ashvale that she had not fully understood. He had been a friend of her father's, not a close friend, not the kind that visited often, but the kind that corresponded regularly and was trusted in a general, steady way. Her father had, apparently, at some point in the last year of his life, given the Duke a degree of oversight she had not known about, not legal authority, more the kind of quiet, understood arrangement that existed between men of similar position who trusted each other's judgment. The Duke had not known about the debt. She was reasonably certain of this from the way Mrs. Pemberton spoke of it, with the careful circumlocution of someone sharing information that the person she was sharing it with was going to find upsetting. He had known that the estate was entailed. He had not known the personal accounts were almost gone. The afternoon she learned this, Madeleine sat in the linen room for a long time with a stack of tablecloths and did not count them. Her father had trusted this man. Her father, who had been careful about trust in the particular way of a man who had been disappointed by it, had given this particular Duke a degree of confidence he had not extended to many. She turned this over in her mind and tried to decide what it meant, and concluded that it meant, at minimum, that the Duke was not simply a powerful neighbor with a passing interest in the property's fate. It meant he was someone who had been watching over things, someone who might, if he discovered there was something to find in that locked cabinet, have a view on whether it should be found. She was going to have to be more careful. She met him properly, which is to say, she spoke to him as herself, or nearly, on a Friday afternoon in December, quite by accident. She had gone to the library to dust it. This was legitimate. The library needed dusting. The fact that she had timed this particular dusting for the hour the Duke typically arrived, and then spent in the library was something she told herself was research rather than strategy, though the line between those two things had been growing increasingly thin. He came in when she was on the library ladder, reaching the upper shelf near the window. She heard the door, heard his boots on the floorboards, heard him stop. "Don't come down on my account," he said. She came down anyway, because standing on a ladder above a duke struck her as insufficiently professional, and turned to face him. He was looking at the shelf she had been dusting, then at her. "You're new," he said. "I've been here nearly 6 weeks, Your Grace." New compared to the house. He said this without any particular inflection, which meant she couldn't tell whether it was an observation or a question. "Yes," she agreed. He moved to the desk, which he apparently used as his own when he was here, which told her something about the intimacy of his relationship with Ashvale that she filed away. "Mrs. Pemberton says you're capable," he said. "Mrs. Pemberton is kind. She isn't, particularly. She's accurate." He sat down, pulled something from his coat, set it on the desk. He had not looked at her again, but she had the distinct impression of being looked at, the kind of attention that doesn't require eye contact. "How long do you intend to stay?" The question caught her, not because it was rude. It wasn't, quite, but because it was precisely the kind of question she had been hoping no one would ask. "As long as I'm useful, I suppose," she said. He picked up his pen, a careful answer. She didn't respond to that. There was nothing safe to say. She finished the dusting and left, and stood in the hall for a moment with the cloth in her hands and her heart making a noise she didn't care for, and thought, he knows something is not right, he doesn't know what. And he will keep looking until he does. She needed to find those papers before he found her. The locksmith's letter came the 2nd week of December. It was not, as she had hoped, an instruction set. It was a polite suggestion that she bring the lock to him, or alternatively arrange for him to visit the house and inspect it, as this particular kind of mechanism was not straightforward to describe in writing. She could not bring the lock to him. She could not arrange a locksmith's visit without Mrs. Pemberton knowing. She stood in the hall with this information, and reassembled her thinking, which took most of an afternoon. It was the cook who solved it, without knowing she had. Mrs. Granger was talking about the new year. People talked a great deal about the new year, when December was cold and the house was quiet, and mentioned that the household was likely to have visitors around Christmastide. As the Duke had apparently indicated, he might send some of his staff over to help with preparations if Ashvale needed it, given the reduced household. Madeleine said nothing. But that evening she got out her list. If the Duke's people were in the house, there would be more movement, more noise, more occasions for someone to be somewhere she was not expected to comment on, if she was clever about it. If she had, say, a copy of the key, which she could obtain not through a locksmith but through the estate manager, whose keys included a master set that had not changed since the old arrangement, and which he kept in his office in the stable yard, unlocked when he was in it, and he was always in it at noon. She could move during that window. She borrowed the key on December the 19th, in the middle of the morning's busiest period, and had it back in 23 minutes. She went to the library that night, when the house was properly asleep, with a candle and the copied key and 4 years of suppressed anxiety burning very quietly in her chest. The lower drawer opened. Inside was exactly what she had hoped. Her father's papers, neatly ordered in the way he had always kept things, in folders tied with ribbon, labeled in his distinctive hand. She worked quickly and quietly, reading headings rather than contents, looking for the one word she needed. She found it in the 3rd folder, Hartwell Trust, Maternal Endowment, Clause 7. Her hands were steadier than she had expected. She read the relevant sections standing at the desk by candlelight. Clause 7 of her maternal grandfather's trust was not, as she had half feared, meaningless. It established a provision for female descendants of the Hartwell line, her mother's family, that existed entirely outside the Fairfax entail. It was modest, it was not Asheville, but it was something. A sum held in trust, accessible on her 25th birthday or upon her marriage, whichever came first. She had turned 25 in September, which meant it was accessible now, which meant all she had needed was to find this document and bring it to a solicitor who was not Hartley of Hartley and Sohn and was not connected to Dunstan Fairfax. She was 25 years old, and there was money she hadn't known about, and it had been sitting in this drawer for 3 months while she counted pillowcases and cracked her knuckles in the November cold. She almost laughed. She pressed her hand over her mouth instead, because laughing at midnight in a library with a stolen key was not something she could afford to explain. She was still standing there, rereading the clause for the 3rd time, when the library door opened. She did not drop the candle. She was proud of this later. The Duke stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves. He had been staying at Asheville for the past 2 days, a fact she had been aware of and had accounted for in her timing. She thought she had accounted for it, with an expression she could not read at all. The silence lasted approximately 5 seconds. In her experience, silences that lasted 5 seconds were the ones that decided everything. "Miss Lacey," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at the folder in her hands. He looked at the open drawer. He looked at her face, which she was keeping completely still with an effort that cost her considerably. Then he came into the room, closing the door behind him, which was either a courtesy to the sleeping household or the worst possible development, and she couldn't immediately tell which. "You have been in this house under a false name," he said. It was not a question. Yes. Since November, yes. He stopped at some distance from her, enough distance that it was not aggressive, close enough that she couldn't pretend this was a casual conversation. Why? She could have continued the pretense. For about 1 more exchange, possibly 2, before it collapsed, she looked at this man who had been her father's trusted friend, who had been watching over this house in some quiet way, who had known something was wrong about her from the first week, and had not acted on it immediately. And she made a decision. She told him. Not everything, not all at once, not in the way she had rehearsed it lying awake in her narrow room, more plainly than that, more simply. Her name, her father, the letters, the entail and the debt and the 43 pounds, the provision in the maternal trust that she had suspected and needed to confirm, the borrowed key. She said all of it in a level voice, standing in her father's library at midnight with a candle, and when she finished, she set the folder on the desk and waited. He was quiet for a moment that was not quite 5 seconds this time, something shorter. "Your father mentioned you," he said. "Often. He said you were the most practically minded person he had ever known, and that this was an enormous waste in the current social arrangement." She felt something move in her chest that was not entirely related to the legal question. "He never said that to me. Men of his generation rarely said useful things directly." He looked at the folder on the desk. "The Hartwell provision. I know of it. I was, in fact, one of the witnesses when your grandfather's trust was amended, though I was very young and barely understood what I was witnessing at the time." A pause. "It is legitimate. I can confirm it. I will. You don't need to. I am aware of what I need to do and what I am choosing to do. Those are different categories." He moved to the chair by the fire, which had burned to low embers, and sat down. He looked, in that moment, less like a duke than like someone who had been awake too long and was making a decision he had been turning over for some time. "Sit down, miss. Sit down, Miss Fairfax." She sat. The chair across from him, her father's chair as it happened, the one that still had the indentation in the leather where he had always sat. "There is a difficulty," the Duke said. "Dunstan Fairfax will contest the provision if it is brought through the standard channels." He will say the document was improperly stored, improperly discovered, obtained under circumstances that are not indefensible to characterize as irregular. He glanced at the cabinet with the copied key still in the lock. He would have a point. I know. There is a way to make this considerably simpler. Legally simpler. Socially simpler. He paused. You are not going to like hearing it. I have been sleeping on a third-floor servant's bed for 6 weeks, Madeleine said. I am prepared to hear most things. Something crossed his face. She thought, distantly, that it might have been the edge of a smile. I have been thinking for some time that Ashvale should not leave this area. The land connects with Carrow at the northern boundary. The estate is a sound one, currently in the hands of a man who will run it into mediocrity within a decade, which I find. He considered the word irritating. I have also been thinking, if I am honest with you, about the matter of a person to share Carrow with, and finding myself repeatedly returning to one specific candidate and being repeatedly unable to find a satisfactory objection. Madeleine looked at him. I am proposing marriage, he said, in the tone of a man presenting a sensible property arrangement, which I understand is an extraordinary thing to say to a woman you have known for 6 weeks in irregular circumstances. I am not asking for an answer tonight. I am asking you to consider it with the same practical mindedness your father admired, and to understand that what I am offering is not nothing. The fire settled. Outside, the moor wind moved through the old oaks on the drive. Madeleine thought about £43 and a candle she couldn't replace until Friday. And she thought about her father's voice, saying practically minded, and she thought about 6 weeks of cold mornings and aching hands, and the particular strange feeling of sleeping warm in a house where she didn't belong by any name anyone in it knew. She thought about the way he had said I will when she hadn't asked him to. I need a week, she said. I expected you to take longer. I'm practical, she said. This time the edge of the smile was not an edge. It was a real one, small but real. Yes, he said, your father was right about that. She took the folder. She went back upstairs. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about what it meant to be recognized by someone who had not needed you to explain yourself, and whether that was the same as being known, and whether being known was the thing she had been actually looking for when she came back to this house in November with a borrowed name and £43, and a faint, stubborn conviction that there was something here worth finding. She said yes on Thursday, not because of the property arrangement, and not because of the trust provision, though those things were not nothing, because of the word will, and the midnight chair by the fire, and a small true smile from a man who had watched over her father's house and was prepared, apparently, to watch over her, not instead of her, watching over herself, but alongside it. The way her father had wished for, she thought, the arrangement he had never quite managed to articulate. She said yes, and she meant it, and that was more than enough to start with.